Hello team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. I was listening to the Rest is Politics podcast here with the background is that these two are from the other side of the aisle from each other. You've got Alistair Campbell, Labour spin doctor from the Blair times, and I know people hold a lot against him in terms of the Iraq war, but actually I'm a big fan of Alistair Campbell these days. He's spot on. He's spot on his on foreign policy and international politics. He's got his finger on the pulse. And on Europe, I agree with him hugely. And also, I really like Rory Stewart, who is a Conservative. I'm halfway through reading his book at the moment, who is a Conservative politician, but he's like a one nation Conservative, old school, small c Conservative in terms of institutions, rule of law, tradition and whatnot, and I like both of these people, and they make an excellent podcast. It's really good. They're both very strong on Ukraine, as you can see here. Actually, they've got one on Georgia. They interviewed the Georgian president recently. It's just a very good podcast, and I missed this one. And my mate sent it to me and was like, "You're like this." I was like, "How have I missed this one?" From 5 days ago, but I think it was recorded last year. So this is recorded at the end of the year, and it's with Ben Wallace, the Secretary of Defence for the UK under the Conservative government. In fact, he's worked under 5 prime ministers because he was fairly consistently seen as like doing a good job. So when you had all this rotation of Conservative prime ministers, he was kept in for quite a long time in that role as Secretary of Defence, then stepped down, saw the writing on the wall, was put forward as a potential for the role of NATO Secretary General, but then sort of pulled out quite early, as it was obvious from different nations as to what they were wanting, and it looked like they wanted someone from within the EU for that role for particular strategic reasons. So anyway, I've always, even though I'm not a fan of the Conservatives, I've always been quite a big fan of what Ben Wallace has done with regard to Ukraine and the UK support of Ukraine. This podcast, this whole interview is fascinating. The first half of it, up to where we join it, is to do with how government works and how the Treasury Department in the UK runs everything. And if you don't have control of the Treasury, they will control you. And it's always a fight to get anything done. It's all about passing it through the Treasury, and the Treasury will try and ruin things from happening if they don't want that money to be spent or whatever. And there was an interesting, I don't know if we're going to catch it in the bit that we're going to be talking about, where he says that there is a lot of dirty money in, we might catch it. I'll see if we do actually. There's a lot of dirty money in London, and the Treasury has previously not done much about it because they don't want to cut that money flow off, and then they had to fight to get things changed. Anyway, this is Ben Wallace talking about Ukraine and Russia.
I'd love to bring you into foreign policy and defence. So
that's Rory Stewart.
Talk us through Ukraine. That was an extraordinary, unique moment. You were the Defence Secretary. Talk us through your evolution. Talk us through what worked. Talk us through what's gone wrong, and give us a sense of that whole moment and your role in that.
Well, it actually started beforehand. I'd been to Ukraine as security minister. I'd been the security minister in some pretty horrendous times, the terrible 2017 terrorist attacks, Manchester, Westminster, all of those attacks, London Bridge. But I'd also been the minister when the Skripal poisoning happened. And it became abundantly clear that, to use the GRU on our streets to deploy nerve agents.
And again, for listeners, GRU is the military intelligence, the Russian state.
Who are mainly currently the in vogue intelligence service that have been assassinating people around Europe, or trying to. And in fact, only in May this year, they were part of a plot to burn down a warehouse in London. So to deploy nerve agent on our streets to kill what they viewed as a traitor, and then tragically took the life of Dawn Sturgeon, is not something any government takes lightly, and is not something that would have been decided by a junior rank of the GRU. It would have come absolutely from the Kremlin and from Putin himself. And I realized that this was a very, very different Putin in Russia from the man who started the journey under Yeltsin. And he didn't seem to care the risks he was putting people in. The Novichok bottle that was full of almost pure Novichok, it was thrown away and put under a bush. Well, I think in a small park where poor old, we think, Dawn Sturgis's boyfriend had found it. If that had been delivered in aerosol, it would have killed 10,000 people.
So just to let those who might not know about this was back in, was it 2017, he was saying, where we had 2 GRU agents. This is where Bellingcat started becoming famous, because they have since identified them. And then that went viral. And then actually Margarita Simonyan interviewed these 2 people. So they were caught on CCTV. They basically came to Salisbury, which is this little cathedral city, tiny little quaint city, if you like, in the south of the UK, just not too far from me, actually. Came there, put Novichok on the door of Sergei Skripal, who was living at a house with his daughter, and in an attempt to kill them. So there's a nerve agent on a doorknob, I think it was. They were caught on CCTV doing that, and they basically went to Salisbury, then left and went back to Russia. Bellingcat worked out who they were. And then he came on TV and announced that, we were just in Salisbury to see the marvellous, I don't know what they said, the marvellous 425-foot spire of the Salisbury Cathedral. They basically read off the Wikipedia page. They just memorised the Wikipedia page. It was hilarious, but it was awful and sinister. And they were clearly like GRU agents, but they were saying they were just on a trip to see the wonderful Salisbury for a day, which was like Russia for a day, and then left. And they had this Novichok agent, and it was in a perfume bottle. And as he said, there's enough Novichok in there that if you did that as an aerosol, it would have killed 10,000 people. They threw that in. I thought they threw it in a bin, and it was picked up by some guy who found this perfume and then gave it to his girlfriend. I think they were both. Were they homeless or something? Anyway, they both died as a result of Novichok poisoning, and Sergei Skripal and his daughter didn't actually. They became very ill when they were in a Pizza Express, and it was all highly controversial because this was the Russians in modern times under Putin coming into one of our cities and attempting to assassinate some dissident Russians, and then actually killing some British citizens. And that was an absolutely horrendous political scandal, as you can imagine.
I mean, this was not a sort of joke. And, I knew then that we are in a very more dangerous place. And totalitarian states or, messianic leaders, wherever they are, you need to read them. You need to read who they are and what they're thinking. So I went out to Ukraine, where we'd had a frozen line since 2014. And people forget, even before the invasion, Ukraine had lost 18,000 people. People were being killed every week on that line. So I went over there to understand the wider network of how Russia was functioning. And so the time we fast forwarded to the Ukraine invasion, and as you know, in foreign policy, Roy, you have to also read human. You have to read the people. I mean, going back to why you should be in politics, politicians can't read the room, shouldn't be politics. I mean, it's staggering how many very bright people can't read the room and make judgments that.
You saw Shoigu, the defense minister, not long before the invasion. Yeah. What were you reading then?
Well, I wanted to.
They were sort of saying this isn't going to happen. Why do you keep complaining?
I mean, so it was pretty obvious from the April before. So Putin wrote an article, which he wrote most of it, the year before, called the sort of historical links between Ukraine and Russia, which was read like a Mein Kampf novel. It evoked ethnic nationalism. NATO is only mentioned in one paragraph in 19 pages. So
important this. So for those who think that NATO expansionism was the reason why Ukraine was invaded, you need to go and read Putin's own essay, where NATO is barely mentioned once. Like, it gets one paragraph in 7,000 words. This is an admission that from Putin that it's all about some kind of, I don't know, ultra-nationalist, ethno-nationalism, imperialism, Putin wanting to be Peter the Great again. It's not about NATO, and I think it's good that Ben Wallace states that here.
Let's the talking points from the sort of MAGA crowd in the United States are all Kremlin talking points. It wasn't mentioned.
That's it.
It was all about his view of destiny and Crimea and all that. And that was him, right? So that's not a spin doctor writing. That was him. So you realise that. And then they had this big exercise the April before. They left all their armoured vehicles, surprisingly nearby. And we did, we could see signs that this was not just a normal exercise. And you add that to the rhetoric, and my judgment was he's going to do it. And I can't talk about intelligence, etc., but there were people within the establishment who didn't believe it.
I remember a few weeks before, very senior US and UK intelligence people saying he's not going to invade.
Yeah, and I think one of the fallings out of the post-Iraq war was in order to protect politicians using too much intelligence or being too reliable on a single report, which is one of the things that came out of Chilcot, is SIS and others were too reliable on one report. We quite rightly do a proper assessment through the Joint Intelligence Assessment, and it's all sort of matrixed and washed and very, very logical. And that's brilliant. But it is only, in my view, advice. And people are not always rational. I mean, I'm having a big row with somebody who said, oh, no, well, Putin's terribly rational. He's not going to do it. Oh, really? Really? I mean, is it rational to use nerve agent in Britain? I mean, when did that become a rational?
I would split hairs a little bit here. And Alistair Campbell goes on to mention this. Actually, it is rational, but garbage in, garbage out, or at least, different things than you think are important being put into the function machine means that you get different conclusions out. So you might not think it's rational to go and do something like that in a foreign country, but it is rational for Putin, given all of the inputs. It's like, I don't want to say it's different rationality. It's the same rationality. You use the same kind of logic, but you have different goals in place and you have different experiences. There's a whole different set of variables that you're playing around with.
Well, I'll what I think was rational about that is that after it happened, and as you say, a British citizen rather than the Russian quotes traitor close quotes was killed, I think he sort of thought, I've got away with that. So the rational in him said, I can get away with a lot more.
Yeah, and he'd murdered someone in Berlin.
Yeah.
An attempted murder in Austria. And the other thing I'd seen as security minister.
So I just want to go back to this point, because it's not like I wondered whether I thought maybe 5 years ago that Putin wasn't a rational agent. I can't remember. I remember having a think about this. Can't remember what my conclusion was, but it doesn't really matter. My point now is that I don't think any world leader's going to be, no one sits there and goes, do you know what? I'm going to do something bonkers. Woo! Like, there's always rationality at play. Like, I'm going to do this because I want to do that. And you might get it wrong. You might get the calculation wrong, but it doesn't mean you're not being rational. It means you're, unfortunately, not considering all the things that you should have considered, or you missed out certain things, or you might have, we all have biases, and it might be that some of those biases weight certain aspects of your rational calculation in certain ways that make it, and some people might say, well, that makes it irrational, we can maybe have a discussion of what rational and what irrational means, but people are applying arguments and cost-benefit analyses to any decision they're making. Putin's going to be someone who is making a decision to do things, and I think he invaded Ukraine not because he's not a rational agent. He invaded Ukraine because and they go on to speak about this, he literally didn't have the right idea of what Ukraine was, and who the people were and how they would react to Russians coming across the border. If you get that wrong, if that goes into your function machine, then you're going to get the wrong, you're going to be using rationality, but it's garbage in, garbage out. It's not like you're not being a rational agent by deciding to do this. You're being rational, but you're using some dodgy inputs.
So is that daily Russia was attacking us in cyber? Daily. And what was interesting is across Europe, different countries would deal with it differently. I won't say, but there was one major power in Europe who just didn't want anyone to know they were being constantly cyber attacked. We're not going to talk about that, as if it was some national embarrassment, So I went to...
Could we have done...
I wonder what country that was. I mean, I'd assume it's going to be something like Germany.
More after the Skripal attack.
I think we could have done more in 2014. I think when he invaded Ukraine... So first of all, after the Skripal, that was the Foreign Office at its best, when they pulled together and we got 153 Russian spies from around the world expelled. And that was definitely the Foreign Office at its best, doing a really good job in our intelligence service and everything else and getting that done. I think we could have all done more then. We could have realized enough's enough, put in financial sanctions much earlier, got rid of all these oligarchs in London who, the security job.
This is where he talks about the dirty money in London.
Was as fascinating as a defence job because I was economic crime minister as well, organised crime. So I could see the dirty money flows. And, every time.
Why didn't we do more about that?
Treasury blocked every effort I ever did to try and make it. I remember discovering that you could register on Companies House a company without even an identity check or a Google check to find out if you're sanctioned. And of course, the owner of the regulators of these bodies are either the Treasury or the Bays, but the Treasury wins. Every time. I remember finding that almost no estate agents had ever reported under a suspicious activity report bags of cash or dodgy purchases of houses. And I'd say, we've got to really clamp down on these things. And I spoke to Ken Clarke about it. He said, it was always the same when I was Chancellor. I never wanted to do anything the Treasury did that. So I sound a bit like angry Treasury person.
Just because the money's... They want the money flowing in.
They do.
They want wealthy people.
Yeah, they're terrified it sends the wrong message. We're not open for business.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's stuff like this that's such a valuable insight to how government works. And the first half of this, he's talking about the power of the Treasury and how they basically run everything, like I said earlier. And here is a great example. It's like, well, we need to make sure that our country is open to business. We need to be attracting inward investment all the time. And if we start closing down these avenues of investment, even if they are dodgy as sin, then we are going to be damaging our chances of getting incoming money from outside of the UK. So you just allow these Russian oligarchs to come and set up shop in London, buy all sorts of property, launder their money through London, and the government says, yeah, we know it's happening, and I guess we're cool with it because money.
No, I'm glad to say a lot of these things have now changed. You cannot just open a business on Companies House.
But there's still an awful lot of dirty money in London.
There's dirty money all over the world,
but we are kind of up there.
No, we've done quite a lot now.
Have we?
We have really. I brought in the first Criminal Finance Act with the unexplained wealth orders. Again, people who didn't like it were people like the Treasury. They wouldn't give us liability coverage, so that if the NCA put an unexplained wealth order on someone and that person's sued for reputation, you should be able to cap that. Right? And so they got quite frightened that some oligarch would annihilate them with a law case. So, and you could then see the tentacles of Russia all over the corrupting methods of corrupting us, both financially, politically. I remember the Russians during the Black Lives Matter riots in America, and when it got really bad, we discovered that the Russians were magnifying both extremes of the debate, both the sort of KKK and the hard militant Black Lives Matter, deliberately to harvest division.
And this is exactly what I talk about all the time, which is either favouring one side or favouring both sides to cause division in a very, very controversial, divisive topic. Black Lives Matters. The protests that took place there, Russia was just going hard in on both sides to just create or amplify that chasm. And they do this with everything. And here Ben Wallace is talking about it. They go on to talk about how much it affected Brexit or not. And there's this constant debate going on about how much effect Russia did have on Brexit. So Alistair Campbell thinks it does have an effect. Actually, Ben Wallace thought it was minimal, even though he's a Remainer from a Conservative point of view, which is interesting. But the Conservative Party have refused to release the report on the effect of Russian interference on Brexit. So,
And I think we can see a little bit of this in a sense that they're ramping up pro-Israeli and anti-Israeli sentiment. I mean, they're really enjoying that sense.
I mean, I think it's a mindset which is... And it's very different from Chinese mindset, which is I think Russia thinks, well, if I can make my rivals weaker, then by default I become stronger. I mean, never mind actually looking after your own population and giving them heating and indoor toilets and making sure that they have a better standard. That doesn't really matter by the looks of things, or broadband, whatever. As long as my enemy is weakened, I become stronger.
Well, their whole media landscape is about, they don't talk about Russia, it's basically Europe's terrible, Middle East is terrible,
it's all being done
America's
to us.
terrible. Yeah. But what about what they did on Brexit, for example? As you say, you're a big Remainer.
Well, so I did read a lot of those reports were not true in the media about,
No, but you can't deny that the Russians sought to influence.
They would have liked. Well, they sought to influence.
Which is true because the social media companies have come out and admit this. I mean, yeah.
Scottish independence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, they like division.
Yeah,
there's no logic to it. They did try.
There is logic to it.
It was pathetic.
Absolutely,
actually.
is logic
in the
to
Brexit debate at one stage. I remember there was some troll factory in St. Petersburg, and the problem was
Internet
they couldn't
Research
quite get
Agency,
British
Prigozhin.
humour right. You know how, because for these memes to take off, you do need to get the humour in the right place for someone to think. And it never quite worked. It never took off. It's like, no, that's not funny. So you have to. But I genuinely, and I would say this as a Remainer, their efforts did not have an effect. And
are we not slightly picking and choosing on that, though?
No, I saw a lot. I mean, I would know whether they were any good at it. I mean, I think we have a lot more to answer for our Remain campaign and how we dealt with it. I mean, our Remain campaign was,
pathetic.
It was.
Those are both Remainers. In fact, all those three are Remainers. Interesting, 2 out of the 3 Conservatives here. I think there's a lot more scope to talk about. It's not like when we talk about affecting a vote, and it's the same with the American vote in the American elections that have just taken place. Some of this is just really unmeasurable. So when you go onto social media and you're bombarded with the same kind of rhetoric and narrative, you can end up going down this rabbit hole and you get sucked in. Now, I don't know that you can measure how, because you don't know an alternative history, so you can't say, okay, if that hadn't happened, let's rewind time and see the effect that would have had on the vote. So I think it's very difficult to ascertain the effect, definitively the effect that Russian disinformation campaigns and Chinese and North Korean and Iranian have had on any given event in time. So I would be somewhat dubious of downplaying this, and not because I think it would have affected. I think the Brexit vote would have gone to leave anyway, but there's a huge amount of help that has been given, as there are in all of these different elections, that is just not welcome in my books. And we need to do far more about the Russian interference. And when you're then refusing to bring out a report on that, then it doesn't look good. So, yeah.
Okay, so back to Ukraine. So we're now in the few weeks leading up to the Putin suddenly in February 2021 deciding to 2022 deciding to advance towards Kiev. Tell us about those last few weeks.
Okay, so going back to all this thing, I had come to the conclusion in the summer before that they're going to do this, and we needed to put some weapons into Ukraine to allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And we're talking about those short-range anti-tank missiles. 300 meters, right? They're not going to hit Moscow or anyone else. The institutions didn't want to do it. Senior members of the establishment, well, that's escalatory. I remember I was asked to go to the celebration of Ukraine independence on its 20-year or 30-year point.
So which institutions are you talking about?
Foreign Office said it would be escalatory to me to attend the celebration of Ukrainian independence.
Spooks?
Some of the spooks, some of the national security institution. And to be fair, this is where Boris was very good. I wrote to...
Which is fascinating, isn't it? So the institutions were against, and this is the UK, providing fairly standard weaponry to, anti-tank guided missiles, but I don't even know that you're talking about NLAWs here, like even shorter range ones, maybe 84s or similar. That was seen as escalatory by the Foreign Office. Wow. So this is a challenge that the UK had in supplying weaponry to Ukraine before the invasion.
Boris, and I said, look, Boris, we need to get some of this stuff in here. We're not talking about the higher levels. We need to give them hope and deterrence. And he said, go to America, see if the Americans are okay. Went to the Americans, they were fine. Came back in September, and it got passed by the relevant national security committees, and then nothing happened. And it kept getting put back on the agenda by the system. And we got
So the weapons were not deployed?
Not until January or December, I think it could be December or January. And that it could have been 3 months earlier. So we got them in January. and then, the drumbeats of war. And there were still people. I mean, I remember going to Germany, and I took with me pictures of the mobile crematoriums the Russians deploy. I mean, you can imagine what that is like. I mean, that's the type of attitude they have to their own forces. Because we know in 2014 they hid all the deaths, they covered them up, cremated them and buried them in fields and things. So I said, look, they are going to do it. And the Germans were like, it's not logical. Why would they do it? And it isn't logical. I mean, who would sacrifice nearly 700,000 of your troops and most of your army? But people were not convinced. I went to Moscow. To be fair,
and this is where I'm sorry to split hairs again, but Russia were being logical. It's just they were putting the wrong inputs in, and he goes on to admit this. Like, he goes on to talk about Shoigu and what he said and how he was reading the room there, that they just didn't think that the Ukrainians would put up resistance, that they would accept them with open arms. And if that's what you genuinely think, then you're going to make decisions that seem illogical, but are perfectly logical. Garbage in, garbage out. It's really important. Now, I really agree with an awful lot that what Wallace says here, but I think words are important.
Yeah, the Scandinavians were convinced, and I used to use Sweden and Finland as a proper marker to the EU. I used to say to the rest of Europe, France and Germany especially, look, if Sweden is worried, you should listen. Right? This is a historical neutral country. It knows its neighbour. It's a mainstream EU country. It's not a sort of traditional Eastern European type. I said, you should listen. And they really got it. The Scandinavians all understood there was a problem and it was going to happen. Something was going to happen or was going to happen. So I went to Moscow the week before, or 10 days before, I think. It was all a bit, if you remember, Liz Truss had then gone. I'd originally invited Shoigu to come. And so remarkably, I then got invited. So I went. I took my chief of defence staff and a team. And it was, quite respectful. We laid a wreath at the Kremlin for the unknown soldier. We had a parade there. And then we went and, it was a sort of classic type of conference room in the ministry. And there was Shoigu, Gerasimov, who was the, undisputed at that stage leader of the Russian military. Obviously some of the GRU people and another general. And I brought my chief of defence staff and my commander of field army, which is an unusual post to bring, but I brought him because he's the guy who would have to deal with any, it was like saying, we have our own capabilities here. And we had a meeting and it was actually, there was a plus and a minus to the meeting. The plus was, I realized then that their planning assumptions were entirely wrong. Shoigu said to me, well, my mother's Ukrainian. They're going to...
That's the point. So it's not illogical, but it's their assumptions that you're feeding into the function machine, which is kind of based on logical rationality. You're saying if this happens, then that will happen. You put all this stuff into there. But if you're putting all the wrong stuff in, then you'll get the wrong stuff out. So this is exactly what, and it's fascinating that we are now hearing, because I've been hitting you with all of the reasons that we know, all the evidence that points towards the fact that, well, I think the conclusion that the Russians had miscalculated. So there were only rations in their vehicles for 5 days. So they're planning on this being a 3-day special military operation where they change the government in 3 days, and they then spend 15 days sort of sweeping up with the Rodzgvardia. So they go in with Rodzgvardia, who are the riot police. They've got parade uniforms in their APCs, rations for only 5 days. So they're getting ready to only eat for 5 days, do this, finish it up, wear parade uniforms, parade around Kiev and say, there you go, bish, bash, bosh. And then you got plans that were found. Then there were so on and so forth. You got all of these different pieces of the jigsaw and say, okay, and the soldiers, we're hearing anecdotes from the soldiers like, we thought they'd welcome us with open arms and flowers. That's what we were told by our bosses. So then you're like, well, are the officers, is a military hierarchy telling this to the soldiers because they believe it themselves, or are they lying to their soldiers? What's the point of lying to your soldiers and then this blowing up? So therefore, it's more plausible that the military hierarchy believed this, and now you're hearing that Shoigu believed this, right? So it genuinely appears to be the case that the Russians thought that they would walk in and have this thing over within 3 days and that the Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms. And this is what Ben Wallace confirms for us here. So this is super interesting. So meeting with Shoigu.
I mean, there was a plus and a minus to the meeting. The plus was I realised then that their planning assumptions were entirely wrong.
That's it.
Shoigu said to me, well, my mother's Ukrainian. They're going to welcome us. I thought, you haven't been to Ukraine recently. I have, and they're they're not going to fight.
There you go.
And Shoigu gave away, he said as I was leaving that basically his army was invincible. I mean, he'd said, we used to be much further down the pecking order. Now we're like in the top.
So you've just heard it. They're going to welcome us with open arms and our army is invincible. That's genuinely what Shoigu believed there. This is a diamond bit of the interview. This is why I wanted, mainly actually this part, why I wanted to play you this video.
So there was hubris, misjunction, and those assumptions are what lead to failures in military plans.
Yes.
Because if you make your plan,
100%,
as we saw around,
we'll
welcome you in Kyiv,
the
girls will want to marry you and everything else, which is what they all thought, the conscripts, basically.
But also Putin's just been told what he wants to hear, though.
So he's just garbage in, garbage out. He's just admitted that. And then Putin, never being told, he actually goes on to talk about this idea of Ranyo, about BS going up the order of command.
Which is what they all thought, the conscripts, basically.
But also Putin's just been told what he wants to hear the whole time.
Yeah. And then they just lied to me. No, we're not going to do it. And I thought his lie was so straight. And there is a thing called Vranyo in Russian, which is
Ranyo.
It's like an abuse, which is, I'm lying. I know I'm lying. I'm still going to lie to you because I'm powerful. I mean, it's a bullying tactic.
But it also goes
I
up
knew
the chain as well.
That somewhere else in that building was a room clearly making the plans for what was going to happen a few days later. And you could tell.
Where do you think it goes now? How does this thing end?
Well, the prescription of what we could do is all there. It's been laid out for 2 years. Europe needs to stand up. It needs to put its money where its mouth is. The one thing Obama and Trump has agreed on since 2014, I think it was, is 2%. Right, so it's bizarre, but it is the one thing I think they actually agree on, and Europe has talked round and round in circles about it.
Sorry, interrupting again. That's that other NATO countries should spend 2% of their GDP on defence.
Yeah, that's it.
The American complaint that Europeans are not spending,
and which is probably low.
It is low, and it is lower, and it's low now
because of what's happening.
Because of what's happening around the world. But it's so the prescription is, we've had 2 years, right? So we could have been ramping up our production, sending more equipment to Ukraine. There are issues in Ukraine. I've written before that one question I've always had for Zelensky is, why didn't you mobilize your people? In 1939 we mobilized men, and in 1941 the Women at War Act, we mobilized women. Right? And if you are against an enemy that wants to annihilate you, as Adolf Hitler did, then why haven't we mobilized? And I think in the war, we spent something like 60% of GDP on our defense. I mean, and we didn't think, but what's going to happen afterwards? We just had to survive. And I think there are some questions around.
So explain that again for listeners. So he has not actually recruited as many young men as people.
He hasn't. Well, when we had the call up, everyone was called up. We all were trained, and then we had conscription in the Second World War. They don't quite have conscription, and Zelensky took a view that he was wanting to preserve the sort of 18 to 28-year-olds or younger, and it's not a mass conscription. Now, I would have said, and I've written it. What I think they should have done is mobilized, asked Europe to train them, right? Because that's not a hard ask. If you ask them to train people, that's not difficult. And then they go back to their houses, they put their helmets under the bed, they put their uniforms in the cupboard, they go back to work, and you can then call them up. And
interestingly, that's what Ukraine have just put in place, as far as I can work out. We were talking about this the other day, where they've got military training and military service, and it's slightly different depending on whether you're in the education or not. And if you're in further education, then you are you do a certain type of training, and if you're not, then you do this other type of training. I think that's military service, and then it's military training, and then it doesn't mean you're definitely going to be called up, but then you've got that training done. And I think that when you are then called up, there's no delay in then having to get you trained and whatnot. I'm pretty sure that that's the same thing that Ben Wallace is talking about here.
It hasn't happened.
Okay, let's get into this then. So 2022, remarkable. Putin does make it through to Kiev. Beginning of 2023, people are really beginning to think about a counteroffensive, this very complicated idea that Ukraine's going to push Russia back. What goes wrong there? Why didn't that work?
I think two things. First of all, we probably were all trying to impose how we do things on them. And Soviet armies didn't quite have the same type of combat engineer. So we always have in our system, combat engineers are the men and women that clear minefields and breach obstacles. And the Russians had been building this obstacle, massive sort of like a obstacle sort of motorway really through the territory they already held. And, you know, to puncture through that, landmines, drones, everything else, is a very big call and very hard. And I don't think Ukraine actually had that capability at the right moment. And also we'd all underestimated the use of Russian landmines. I mean, the Russians have millions of these things, and they were just throwing them out the back of their cars, you know, literally. So the minefields were deep. They weren't just shallow, you know, they were putting mines on top of mines. So you clear the first mine and the second one goes off. And at the same time, cheap drones, which is the real new phenomenon of this battlefield, is you can be found anywhere. I mean, these cheap drones flying everywhere, whether they're dropping anything or just watching. So in armored warfare, you have to assemble. You have to concentrate your force to then punch through the barrier. And the problem is, if you're in your assembly point and somebody with a 200-pound drone has spotted you, suddenly the artillery comes in and you don't get to congregate or muster in the way you're supposed to. So if you can't concentrate your forces to punch through, it becomes harder. And then you get stuck in a minefield, and then the Russian artillery is vast. So it was a very difficult time. There were some successes. Kherson, if you remember, we got to the north side of the strait, looking opposite into Crimea, and indeed since then people have crossed over. There were some successes, but obviously Russia managed to repel that. But the other thing is, at great cost. I mean, no other, maybe apart from President Xi, no other nation would survive losing 700,000 of its own citizens.
Right. This is a remarkable admission from Ben Wallace here. So here's your Secretary of Defense giving you what his conclusion is, or at least former Secretary, as to how many Russians have died.
Dead or injured.
How many do you reckon are dead? How many Russians do you think have died?
Well, the figure we talk about is dead, injured, or deserted.
Right, but how many do you reckon are dead? 250,000?
I'd say 250,000 plus. I'd say that. I mean, they were losing
250,000 plus. So there's someone that should have the access, certainly did up until the election in July this last year, saying, I'd say 250,000 plus. 250,000 plus dead Russian soldiers. Now, we can talk about where other intelligence services would get their figures from and how it's broadly going to be contingent upon what Ukraine declare themselves. But wow, I think that's a fascinating admission.
I had 1,500 a day recently, fighting over an empty shell of a village. You know, he doesn't care, right? I mean, and you know, there's a reason he's had to now rely on North Koreans. I mean, he doesn't care. And this is the big test for the West, is just as we see in the Middle East, it's about resolve, right? And now the problem is, what are we going to do in a world where the dictators have no regard for their own population at all? And they believe that's the way you win, you know, because...
Well, he's sort of being proved right.
Well, that's what we've got to be very careful about. We've got to be very strong on our resolve.
But is there not an argument that we have been rhetorically saying to Ukraine, we will back you as long as it takes, come what may? But I know you made the comment about, you know, sometimes they treat us like a kind of Amazon store.
Well, no, that was a misquote. I'd said, we're not Amazon, we're a partnership.
Okay.
Because I had offered training in Britain,
So it wasn't just about
I need
kit.
people to train. And if you don't give us people to train, you can keep buying all the stuff you like.
Right, okay.
But people will lose their lives.
But there's been a sort of pattern where Ukraine kind of says what it wants from the military Amazon, and then there's all the politics takes over here in America and Europe, and then we don't give them what they want when they're asking for it, and then eventually we do, but meanwhile Putin's moved on to something else.
Yeah, no, and I found that terribly frustrating, and you know, he's a bully. I mean, that's how I view it, right? And for a bully to be successful, all he has to do is intimidate, and people to fear him. And
this is where it gets onto another fascinating point that's really revealing about anti-escalation rhetoric or ideology.
Putin is a bully, and he needs to be stood up to.
But what does standing up to him mean?
Well, first of all, you don't have these ridiculous debates about Storm Shadow, not Storm Shadow. I mean, let's not forget, over these last nearly 3 years, we had rows about anti-aircraft missiles.
Yep.
We had rows about tanks. We had rows about not even
Planes.
Storm Shadows, planes. You know, every single time you go round in a circle.
But is that because we're democracies and he's a dictatorship?
No, it's because I
Or is it
think
because we're just not delivering on the words that we're promising?
because there are parts of our systems, as in our government, who believe that escalation, who believe his rhetoric on escalation and are
So they are intimidated by the nuke threat.
Absolutely. Well, all threats. No, I mean originally.
But every time every time that we are deemed to be escalating, they sort of put out, don't forget the nukes.
I mean, they've got that drunk Medvedev lurking around the game show hosts. You know, I mean, look, Putin knows that like for like, NATO versus a unified NATO versus Russia in conventional methods is done. Right, Russia loses in conventional, and in fact, is definitely going to lose now because he has got no army left, really. Right.
It's exactly what I say. We've long said this. Like, NATO could absolutely hammer the crap out of Russia, and especially now Poland could beat Russia in a conventional war. It's only nukes that is the only thing they have.
So he is
definitely going to lose.
On a conventional battle. Russia would lose
Against a unified NATO.
With
the United States involved.
With the United States. Yeah. With the United States involved. It's part of the key. But absolutely. Remember how much he has lost in his modern arsenal. I mean, you know, when you're resorting to firing Iranian drones and sort of ballistic missiles and human wave attacks, that's not the battle they were configured for. But yeah, he evokes nuclear. He's done it 30, 40 times. He evokes it.
And so what about Trump? Where, how do we feel about
30,
NATO,
40
Trump,
times
future
threatens
thereof?
Nuclear.
Well, on one level, Trump has a legitimate cry to say, you've been warned since 2014 by Obama as well, that you need to pick up the pace. You know, people forget the Americans are on the hook for 300,000 plus personnel to come to our aid. Right? So if I was a Secretary of State carrying that liability, I'd be a little bit, thank you very much. And we have been, and, go back to really 1991 onwards, we have been corporate raiding the defence budget to pay for our other, I wouldn't call them luxuries, but to pay for our social policies. And maybe that's a decision that all the governments, both Labour and Conservative government, and I get misquoted constantly by John Healey, who I have a lot of respect for, my successor, or one of my successors. But both Labour and Conservatives in their time have reached for the defence budget when it suited them. Mm-hmm. Right?
And this is what I've talked about a lot, which is the understandable pressures of when you're in peace, saying, well, we need to build a load of hospitals. Are we going to buy some more tanks or build a load of hospitals? Well, do we need tanks at the moment? No, we're at peace. Do we need hospitals? Yes, we do. Okay, let's build hospitals and sod the tanks. But of course, spending on military is an insurance policy, and at some point you're going to probably have to draw on that insurance policy, and when you do, you're going to hope you've got a really good policy, and you won't have a good policy if you're not paying for it. So this is kind of like, I'm sure this is a good analogy. The good analogy is, well, I mean, I haven't had a car crash for the last 10 years, so I mean, if I don't pay my car insurance, then actually I can afford to fix a washing machine and get a new fridge or something like that, right? So you're like, and I need those things, so let's just hope I don't crash, and then I'm going to save money on not having car insurance, and then that's fine for a couple of years, and then a crash, and then bugger, I've got no car insurance. Oh dear, I'm in all sorts of trouble. So I lose my car, I can't afford this, etc., etc. So yeah, we're not at war, but if we don't keep paying into this insurance policy of keeping our defence up and running and spending enough on defence, then when we do come to need it, if we haven't been paying annually for a really good defence cover, we're going to be screwed. And that's the point that Europe's got to.
And that's, I've been in a hollow armed forces under both Labour and Conservative. I've been in those hollowed forces. So I think Trump is probably, I suspect, going to require more of a subscription to be a member of NATO. Now, what that is, 2.5 or 3%, I don't know, and what time he'll put on it. When it comes to Ukraine, it's quite interesting. I've been reading some of the comments by his picks, first draft picks, his picks for government. Some of them are quite contradictory. I think it's the National Security Advisor who said Putin views a ceasefire as an opportunity to reload, right? And some of them have been quite harsh on Putin.
One of them said he's a murderous thug and he doesn't know what's going to hit him.
So, but then others, obviously, like the Hawaiian, whatever she's lady is, the
Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, and the basic trend though with most of them is to say China is the priority, Russia's a distraction, all these supplies were, and even Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor who you're quoting, has said he's very reluctant to provide more Patriot missiles because it involves stripping the Patriots they could use against China.
Everyone is worried about our own stocks. I mean, we've spent stocks or gifted stocks to Ukraine. Everyone has, and that inevitably comes from your own stocks.
So let's we don't quite know what Trump will do because reading his mind is quite difficult. But let's imagine the worst case scenario where he really feels that he's said America does not want to spend another $50 billion next year helping Ukraine against Russia. And that he's sort of hinted to his voter base that he's not about to spend a huge amount of money helping Ukraine next year. Would Europe be able to step up without that $50 billion to America? And what would be involved? What would be the challenges?
Let's say to cut something else. I mean, my whole...
So we'd have to mobilise.
My whole effort was to change the culture of where defence sat in the public sector choice of spending. Ultimately, we can argue about 2.5, 3%, whatever, but ultimately, both governments had got out of the habit of talking about defence as core. It'd been a stick-on discretionary spend. The Treasury would dollop some underspend from another department into you, but no one was really prepared to say, look, we're going to spend less on roads this year because we're going to spend more on transport. We're going to spend less on the NHS, whatever you want to choose from them. That was never going to happen. And even when I felt very pleased that I got Rishi over the line and put a date on 2.5, that was going to be funded out of cutting civil servants, right? If we really want to be honest about defence spending and how much heavy lifting we're going to have to do, someone's going to have to be brave, whether it's Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch, and stand up and say, you know what, next year we're spending less on the roads budget or less, or whatever budget you want to choose. And until that happens, the public don't buy the smoke and mirrors of, we're going to cut bureaucracy, like magic.
And so that's the UK. How about the rest of Europe? Can you see them really stepping up if the US cut 50 billion? I mean, is it likely? I mean, I agree. I
think some will. Unfortunately, the smaller powers will.
Poland
is definitely. I mean, Poland is going to replace Britain within the EU as its role it plays. If you want I think it's the fifth biggest economy already. It's a highly productive economy. It's spending, I think, towards 4% of GDP. It's going to become Europe's security voice, European Union security voice, not the continent of Europe, and one of its big power bases. And it's going to be very interesting to see how France and Germany accept that. So they will. The Scandinavians are already in a better position. Their forces are better at being ready. They're not massive, but they're good at it. I think the question will be, would France and Germany? That's going to be a big question. Would Italy? And would Spain? And if you really want to get going, remember, I think it's shocking. I think 78% or maybe 82%, somewhere around that, of all of NATO spending is by countries outside the EU. Right. So what I understand Macron's call for an EU army and all these. I don't agree with it, but it's all pie in the sky if your security is paid for by Canada, America, Britain, and Turkey. Right? I mean, it's pie in the sky, and Putin knows it.
On being out of the EU, sorry to sort of return to the obsession. I'm going to put you a little theory. So you were in the frame to be NATO General Secretary. You were ish, right? And George Robertson, who had been one of your predecessors when we were in power, became General Secretary of NATO. I think Brexit did for you.
I think
discuss.
It's possible. I mean, just
what Alistair Campbell is saying is you might well have been the Secretary General of NATO had Britain not gone out the EU, had Brexit not happened, because you would have been seen as an EU entity, and therefore you'd be much more likely to be selected by other EU members.
On the Sec Gens, I can tell you that the background of this was Mark Rutte was what everyone had thought, and we were all happy
Dutch
with.
Prime Minister. Yeah.
The Dutch Prime Minister. Biden personally asked him at least twice, and he said no. So when he said no, we saw a vacancy, and we thought, yes, we'll put me in. I hadn't gone into defence to be the Secretary General of NATO, and yeah, definitely elements of the French and German establishment did not want me to be the Secretary of NATO, and they wanted an EU person, I think. Within those systems, though, it was quite interesting. So within the French system, I had supporters, right? Because I'm not, I'm quite happy to stand up to the United States, and I have done in my own time. And I fundamentally believe that we cannot just go spend our life buying completely American equipment. We need to invest in our own, I would say.
This is, again, really interesting stuff, because this is exactly what I've been talking about with regard to the EU's position on procurement from within the EU. And that includes, actually, in that case, the UK, because the UK's BAE Systems wants to operate within the EU, and we're doing these security deals with the EU. And so kind of is seen as part of that, arguably. But here we've got Ben Wallace talking about actually how some people in France like Ben Wallace, because even though Brexit and everything, actually he's stood up to the US before, and we need to think about our own defence industries over here rather than always relying on buying from the US.
Our life buying completely American equipment. We need to invest in our own, I would say that coming from Lancashire, we need to invest in our own defence capabilities and things. And if we're entirely dependent on the United States for our defence, there'll be no industry. Thousands of people will not have their job, and we'll get what we're given. And by the way, that does mean back of the queue when it comes to defence. You have to wait till they build their ships. So I think there were some, yes, and I think Biden was always iconic. He didn't want to upset the French and Germans. That was a long-running theme in them. Look, to be fair, Olaf Scholz and I do not get on. I was pretty. I've been very publicly critical of him. Not when I was serving, but I have since. But during my tenure, he blamed me for the tanks. I embarrassed him because I put Challenger tanks into Ukraine.
Fascinating.
It made him have to do that in the end. So didn't always get on with the SPD German defence team.
The much vaunted Pistorius that people keep saying.
He's good. No, he's okay. Yeah. He's okay. But I had the previous one, Christian Lebret, before that.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But also, it was Olaf Scholz. It wasn't, to be fair to Boris. I mean, Boris is perfectly good at Pistorius. I mean, he could be in the running to be... He might remain defence secretary in a grand coalition of the Germans. Yeah. But ultimately, I used to feel that Germany, were holding back. We're trying to play a game that was too clever by half on Putin.
Fascinating.
Israel-Palestine.
And then you go on to talk about Israel-Palestine. But I'd love to just listen to him talk about, say, Germany and their positioning on Ukraine and Russia, and what issues he has with Olaf Scholz. He says he doesn't see eye to eye with Olaf Scholz at all. Boris Pistorius, the defence minister, is all right. He's a good one. But yeah, so some fascinating insights in that, and it's a really good interview. And I almost would like to, the whole thing's an hour and a half, and they talk half of the entire interview is just about, the machinations of British politics, and, maybe a further third then is about Ukraine. I'd love to hear like 3 hours on Ukraine and the politics concerned in Europe and with America, and what Biden's view was and position, and so on and so forth. What a fascinating insight that already was, but it leaves me wanting more from Ben Wallace there. Hopefully that's of use to you. I only it wasn't so much a reaction. It's just like, you might not go and watch it. Go and watch the whole thing, but it's easy for me to say, go and watch this video, but the chance of people actually clicking on it are fairly slim. And I think there were enough nuggets in there to give us some decent information about what's been going on. And the beginning of the war there, interesting. The power of anti-escalation ideology, not just in the US, is not just kind of a Jake Sullivan Biden thing, but actually each of these governments have, like with the UK, we didn't even want to give freaking anti-tank AT4s or whatever they were. I don't know, maybe NLAWs. We didn't want to give them prior to the invasion. We're like, oh, that's going to be escalatory. And then as it turned out, we ended up giving tanks, and then that annoyed Olaf Scholz because then he had to give tanks, and it's all of these consistent arguments about different weapons where we say no, but then eventually say yes, and it's so frustrating. What position would Ukraine have been in had we said yes initially to all of those different things? Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of some use. As I say, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.